Greetings there, academic proletariat. This is Mr. Olson coming at you this time from quarantine with this rendition of the Fireside Chats. Today we're going to be discussing the critical period, the years 1781 to 1789, that time frame right after the American Revolution, all the way up until when the Constitution goes into effect and George Washington takes his place as our first president. So before we begin, I just want to remind you that there is a guided note sheet that goes along with this video to help focus your note taking and make it a little bit easier on you. Top of the sheet looks like this. It's available to my classes on Schoology. If you don't have availability to that, you can always send me an email and I'll be sure to hook you up. Okay, so to get this party started, I want you to go ahead and define the critical period. Take about 30 seconds. You can talk to the person next to you, or if you're alone, you can talk to your imaginary friend. Go ahead and define the critical period. While you're doing that, I just want to go ahead and thank studious young people like Michael Fiedler and Daniel McIntosh, and Chewy, who sit in the front row. I think that sitting in the front row is absolutely awesome and the key to success. So if you're sitting in the back, shame on you. Why don't you get yourself to the front of the room sometime soon? Alright, so I would define the critical period by saying that it's a period that the United States could have failed, right? If you think about somebody in critical condition, there's a chance that they might die. And during this time period, there was a good chance that the United States might die. That's why it's called the critical period. There were a lot of decisions made during this time period that sort of prolonged the existence of the United States just long enough to sort of get it over that hump. But if things had gone the other way, well, we could have been flatline. So America's lucky to have made it through this period, but that's why it's called critical. It's important to the longevity of the United States. So now while we're discussing this time frame, I want to go ahead and throw out some important dates to you. The year 1781 is an important date. I want you to try and think of why right now. Go ahead. Hopefully you identified that as the Battle of Yorktown, the battle that ended fighting in the American Revolution. Now, another important date in this period is 1783. That would be the year that the Treaty of Paris No. 2 is ratified. And the Treaty of Paris No. 2, of course, is that which ends the Revolutionary War. Britain recognizes America's sovereignty. It also cedes all land east of the Mississippi River to the United States. 1787 is an important year. I want you to go ahead and think about that right now. Go ahead. This one's a little bit more difficult, but hopefully you came up with Shays' Rebellion. We'll talk about Shays' Rebellion a little bit more. And then finally, 1789 is the year that the Constitution is finally put into effect and George Washington becomes the first president. All right. So now, it's important to identify the problems that America faced during the critical period, and the list is quite long, so bear with me. First of all, states had amassed large amount of debts as a result of the Revolutionary War. Remember, state militias did a lot of the fighting, and those states had to front some money to pay for those militias and to pay for the war effort. So after the war was over, they were left with a lot of debt. And for the same reasons, the federal government was left with a lot of debt as well. Most of their debt was with countries overseas like the Netherlands and France, from whom America had borrowed money from them during the Revolutionary War, and it was now time to pay that money back. So there's a large amount of debt there. No debt to China yet. That's going to come later, but still debt to other countries for sure. There was an issue with the money supply. If you look at these pictures down here, these are North Carolina monies that would have existed during the period of the Articles of Confederation. And if North Carolina had their own money, what does that mean? All states had their own money. So if you can think of all states having their own money, it's going to make for sort of a problem in trading along state lines. There's also an economic depression that set in after the Revolutionary War was over, which usually happens after wars because countries stop buying things and manufacturers aren't producing as much as they had for the war effort. So economic depressions usually do set in. There's also a important question with regards to how to manage land in the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Territory of these green 5 what will become states, Ohio being the most problematic because it was the closest one to the already established eastern seaboard. And if you take a look at this map, it sort of goes into detail with just how crazy land management was. I mean, seriously, if you look at some of these claims, like this area right here, if you can see the mouse, was claimed by both South Carolina and Georgia. If you look over here, claimed by Massachusetts, ceded to New York, so the land is changing hands. Vermont was claimed by both New Hampshire and New York. Finally, it was given its right to be a sovereign state. But so there was a lot of ambiguity with regard to who owned what, and not a lot of cooperation going on there. There were also defense threats, especially from the British, who failed to leave the Midwest, and they were still occupying forts even after the Revolution was over. Spain was being an issue to the United States as well because it wouldn't allow the U.S. to trade in New Orleans. Obviously, Indians are an ongoing issue. And then there was a group of pirates in Europe that were harassing American ships, not letting them trade. And so that became problematic as well. If you take a look at this map, notice that Spanish Florida down here, and then also everything west of the Mississippi, right after the Revolution, was owned by Spain, which gave Spain control of the Mississippi River. Now, we all know that New Orleans is down here, right, because we took our map test and we did really, really well on it. And New Orleans is a key port because it allows access to the Mississippi. Spain controlled New Orleans and didn't play nice with Americans that wanted to trade out of there. So it was difficult for American commerce to really keep up without being able to trade on the Mississippi. So you have issues with defense as well. And then finally, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but you had problems of domestic tranquility. Hopefully that phrase rings a bell. We'll talk about why it rings a bell in a second. So those are the problems that need to be addressed, and the government addressing or tasked with addressing those issues is called the Articles of Confederation. It was our country's first written government. It was established in 1777, which is during the war, and it sort of kept going on through the end of the war, and it was the governing body once the war was over, and it was, well, terrible. And let's talk about why. It deliberately set up a weak federal government. And I want you to think to yourself, why would America want to have a weak federal government? They just got done fighting who? Britain. Good. And Britain had what kind of government? Monarchy. Good. So Americans didn't want a king. Good. So they deliberately set up a weak federal government. Here are examples why. There was no executive branch because that's too king-like. It had one house, which means there was only one governing body, and it was Congress, and there was only one House. In that House, there were 13 states. Each state got one vote. In order to pass a law, you needed 9 out of the 13 states to agree to it, a supermajority, which, if you think about it, the likelihood of that happening is relatively low. Now, I want you to think of the likelihood of this. In order to amend the Articles of Confederation, you needed a unanimous vote. What are the chances of that happening? What are the chances of Georgia and Massachusetts agreeing on something? Hopefully you thought to yourself, nothing, and so the likelihood of there being amendments is very, very low. Also, and probably the biggest issue, was that the Articles had there was no ability to collect taxes because Americans were wary of taxes. And so it was just something that has continued on to this day, but they didn't give the government that right. So if you recall, one of the issues was that America was in a lot of debt. How do you pay back debt with no taxes? Well, it gets kind of hard. Now, there was also no way to regulate interstate commerce. See, the Articles of Confederation saw the states as being their own separate entities. So for the Articles to be able to control commerce between those states would have been overstepping its power. So the states had to sort of come to agreement with each other. And now, so you did have this one house, but even in that one house, the powers were limited. For example, they could coin money, but so could the states. And so most of the states then coined their own money and didn't use the federal money. They could declare war, and they could conduct foreign affairs, and they could make treaties. But other than that, they really couldn't do much. All of these things would be very, very useful if you were still fighting European power. We'll call them England. So it was able to sort of deal with problematic England, but everything else kind of difficult. And finally, it was unable to draft troops, which means it couldn't have an army, couldn't have a navy. If it wanted to muster an army, it had to ask the states nicely for that army, which, as you can imagine, after a long war, didn't go over too well. So, what did the Articles do? Well, they won the war, so that's something to be happy about. Now, the biggest success of the Articles of Confederation were the organization of Western lands and three actions taken by the Articles government organized Western lands. The first being the Land Ordinance of 1784, which was followed subsequently by the Land Ordinance of 1785. These two land ordinances organized land for sale and administration. So the land that is in the Northwest Territory, this area right here that's outlined in red, the land ordinances got that land ready to sell to people, and that was a way that the government could make money. It was the only way the government could make money, and even though they made some money off of it, there wasn't a ton of money coming in. Now, the more famous and the more important for you to know is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This set up the procedures for admitting new states out of this area. So the Northwest Territory was outlined in red here. The Northwest Ordinance set up the procedure for how these territories were going to become states. Notice our great home state of Illinois is in that Northwest Territory, and it is going to become a state based on the guidelines set up by the Northwest Ordinance. And now, an important foreshadowing moment for us is that the Northwest Ordinance outlaws slavery in all 5 of these territories, and that's going to be something that we come back to later. Okay, so now to get a closer look at these, the land ordinances and the Northwest Ordinance, here's how the land ordinance set up land, or organized the land. It split land into squares, so 1 square mile, or 640 acres, would be surveyed out. And then in that square, they would split it up into even smaller sections, so you could sell it to various people with different money. Now, if you took 36 of these squares and put them together, it would be called a township, kind of like Palatine Township, kind of like Elk Grove Township, which is why. And each one of these townships was going to get a school. So that's why we are in Township High School District 214, and that's why next door to us is Township High School District 211, because Illinois was set up with these townships. Now, just to give you kind of perspective, this is what the land surveyed would have looked like before the land ordinance, and this is what it looked like after. So if you set things up in squares, it makes it a lot nicer to survey. It also makes it a lot more obvious for who owns what, and then come the time of roads, it's going to be a lot easier to lay roads down then as well. Okay, so now the problems related to the Articles of Confederation really came to a boiling point in Shays' Rebellion, which was a rebellion that took place in the latter months of 1786 and the early months of 1787. Here's how it worked. Massachusetts was one of many states that was foreclosing on debt-encumbered farmers. So farmers were unable to pay the mortgages that they had taken out on farms for a myriad of reasons. First of all, there was an economic depression, and it's always hard to pay stuff back during an economic depression because farmers aren't making a lot of money. Farmers who had bought war bonds during the Revolutionary War weren't getting them that money paid back because, well, the government didn't have any money to pay back, so how is it going to pay back the war bonds? And then finally, many of the farmers, especially in western Massachusetts, Daniel Shays included, were veterans, and the government wasn't able to pay its veterans because it had no money. Remember, it wasn't able to collect taxes. That's right, taxes. So it was hard for them to pay back any money. Now, Daniel Shays is going to get mad at the fact that the courts are foreclosing on these farms, so he's going to lead a rebellion against the courts. He's going to march to the courts with other farmers who are angry. They have their pitchforks and they have their swords. And they close down the court, they shut the doors, and they say, stop foreclosing on our farms. Now, eventually the rebellion is going to be put down. The Confederation government is going to be able to put together a group of troops big enough to squash the rebellion, but it really scares a lot of people. For example, George Washington writes a letter to Henry Knox the day after Christmas in 1786, saying, "Good God, who besides a Tory or a Briton could have predicted all of these terrible things that are happening?" He's talking about the disorders which have arisen in these states, explicitly referring to Shays' Rebellion. So if it scares somebody like George Washington, and if it scares rich people, you can bet something is going to get done. So a bunch of delegates, 55 to be exact, meet together in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. But when they get themselves locked in this room, they realize that revising the Articles is going to be kind of a useless task. So instead, they're going to write a new government. Okay, chief among these framers or founding fathers is James Madison, this ruggedly handsome-looking man right here. He's actually kind of scary-looking and really short to boot. Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington, who was chosen unanimously to oversee the convention. So, like I said, there are 55 delegates, and they're mostly wealthy. They're mostly educated. There are no small farmers present, and of course, there's no women present either. And everybody there is white. Okay, just a couple of side notes. Thomas Jefferson's not there, and John Adams isn't there because they're both off in England, gallivanting around, sort of being ambassadors. The people who are there, though, James Madison is the key guy. His nickname is the Father of the Constitution, which is why he can be seen here asking, "Hey, Constitution, who's your daddy?" Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Crash Course U.S. History for a minute, and I'm going to let John Green explain, just in other words, what was going on in the delegation and who was there. So you should be filling out the question on your guide that asks you to describe the members of the Constitutional Convention.
The first attempt to do something was a meeting in Annapolis in 1786 aimed at better regulating international trade. Only 6 states sent delegates, but they agreed to meet the next year in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. The delegates who met in Philly the next year had a funny definition of revision, though. Rather than make tweaks to the Articles, they wrote a new charter of government, the Constitution, which is, with some significant alterations, the same one that Americans live under and argue about today. Despite what some seem to believe, the 55 men who met in Philadelphia and hammered out a new form of government were not gods, but they were far from ordinary, especially for the time. Most were wealthy, some very much so. More than half had college educations, which was super rare since 0.001% of Americans attended college at the time. About 40% had served in the army during the war. But one thing they all shared was a desire for a stronger national government.
Okay, thanks, John. So now they're in this room, locked in, secret, and so they boarded up all the windows. It's the middle of the summer in Philadelphia, and tempers are flaring. Now, there's one notable debate that I just want to touch on for a second at this convention, and that's a debate revolving around whether or not a large republic can actually work. So there's 2 schools of thought with regard to this issue. The first one is by a guy named Baron de Second Montesquieu or something like that. I think it was Charles de Second Baron de Montesquieu. Anyways, he had a long, goofy name. Anyways, he wrote in a book called The Spirit of Laws that political institutions should reflect the community, because if you have too diverse a population, a government cannot function because you have too many different interests vying for power. Now, James Madison, the architect of our Constitution, argued against that in a very famous article called The Federalist number 10, where he says that a republic is actually the best safeguard against factions, because if any one group tries to overthrow the majority will band together and squash that minority group that's trying to take power. So in that sense, a coup can't work. Like, for example, if Catholics went to Washington, D.C. and tried to take over the government, other Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and different religious groups would band together to squash the Catholics. So James Madison argues that, in fact, a large republic is a good thing, and it will make sure that this form of government will last for a long time. Okay, so now the Constitution is eventually agreed upon by the men in the hot room, and here's what they give us. They give us a document that has a preamble, which we'll talk about in a second, a document that has 7 articles. The first 3 are the most important. The first one sets up Congress, the second one sets up the executive branch, and the third one sets up the judicial branch and federal courts. Key ideas that exist in this document and make this document work that I'm sure you've heard about in the 7th grade when you had to take a constitution test are checks and balances, which is the idea that different branches will check each other and balance the power out. Separation of power, which just outlines the existence of those different branches. And then finally federalism, which is a system and an idea of government where states and federal governments are sort of separated, but they still work together. They somehow coexist. Federalism is going to be one thing that's continuously tried in America. Now, this form of government is actually modeled off the British government. There's a president or a kingly-like figure. There's an aristocratic house, what we call the Senate, and there's a democratic house, which we call the House of Reps, which has the power of the money. So you sort of have a lower house dictating money and dictating a lot of the actions of an upper house who sort of work with this one kingly-like figure. So basically, we want to be Britain. More to be said on that in a second. Now, if you don't know the preamble, I'm going to give you a chance to write it down right now.
About the Constitution. Hey, learn about the USA. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers did agree to write a list of principles for keeping people free.
You can sing along if you know the words.
The USA was just starting out a whole brand new country. So our people spelled it out, the things that we should be. And they put those principles down on paper and called it the Constitution. And it's been helping us run our country ever since then. The first part of the Constitution is called the preamble and tells what those founding fathers set out to do. We the people.
Just so you know, this guy would not have been here.
Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. Provide for the common defense. Promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty. To ourselves and our posterity.
She can't vote.
And establish this Constitution for the United States of America. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers all sat down and wrote a list of principles that's known the world around. The USA was just starting out a whole brand new country, and so our people spelled it out. They wanted a land of.
Can you tell that the people in the 1970s were on a lot of drugs?
Goes like this. We the people.
Yeah, it would not have been there. Just saying.
Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. Provide for the common defense. Promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty. To ourselves and our posterity do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. For the United States of America.
Well, that was fun. So hopefully you picked up on the line to ensure domestic tranquility, because that's a direct reference to Shays' Rebellion, because a lot of the framers saw Shays' Rebellion as a sort of upsetting of democracy, so they wanted to make sure that that kind of thing never happened again. So now at the Constitutional Convention and in the Constitution itself, there were several conflicts that came up and compromises that had to be sought. So we'll go through these really quickly, and there'll be more on these in future classes. But if you're understanding sort of how the Constitution came to be, it's imperative that you understand these conflicts. So the first conflict that came up was, how are states going to be represented? Because there's big states and there's small states, so we have to figure out a way to represent them in Congress. So the Virginia Plan, which was one that represented large states, said that there should be 3 branches of government, and that the representation in the House and Senate would both be based on population all the time. So that means that bigger states would have more reps, smaller states would have less reps. So small states come and they see this as a threat to their power. So to the New Jersey plan, New Jersey was a smaller state at the time, said that there should be one House and it should be based on equal representation, something similar to what the Articles government had. And so they argue about this for a time, and they basically come to an agreement. The agreement is called the Connecticut Plan, but there's no reason to know that. And the agreement is this, that members will be elected by the people for the House, and the number of reps in the House will be based on population. And in the Senate, there will be an equal representation for the states. So each state is going to get 2 senators. This is called, and write this down, the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise determines representation in Congress. The next issue that came up was, how are slaves going to be counted into this representation? Now, this is probably not going to be a surprise to you, but the North, which had been gradually abolishing slavery for a while and didn't have a lot of slaves, thought that slaves shouldn't count at all. The South, which had a ton of slaves, thought that slaves should count a bunch, and so they needed to come to some sort of an agreement. So they pick 3/5. This is really bizarre and Byzantine, so try and wrap your minds around this, but it was thought that a slave did 3/5 the work of a free worker. So that's why not their vote, but their existence would count as 3/5 of a person with regard to representation in Congress. So that means that states that have slaves would be able to count their slaves into the population as 3/5 of a person, because remember, the more population you have, the more members you get in the House. Okay, now in sort of to give the South something back, because the North wasn't allowing them to count slaves as one whole person, the North would promise to enforce fugitive slave laws, which said that if a slave escaped from the South, the North would help get him back. So essentially it was like this: for every 5 people in the population, 3 slaves you would be able to count 5 slaves for 3 people. Okay. The next conflict that came up was the slave trade, and this one's not that hard. The North hated the slave trade, the South loved the slave trade, and so what they did was they came to an agreement to allow it for 20 more years until 1808. The slave trade would be allowed in North America. Now, this sounds like it might be a win for the North, but if you think about it, if I'm South Carolina and the slave trade is going to end in 1808, what am I going to do in 1807? Hopefully you said something like import as many slaves as possible, which is exactly what they did. And the last and another important conflict that arose at the Constitutional Convention was who should elect the president. Now, some thought that the president should be elected by Congress because they were able and they had the wherewithal to make a good decision. Others thought that the president should be elected directly by the people. Imagine that. Anyways, the resolution is the institution of the Electoral College, which says that each state will be given a number of electors based on the number of representatives it has in Congress, and then for a while, the electors were allowed to vote however they wanted. Today, most states, whoever wins the popular vote, the state wins all those electors. This compromise was crafted by James Wilson and remains sort of the laughingstock of the world, as this image shows you. people think that the Electoral College is really a stupid idea. But you know what? Go America. Okay. So anyways, the Constitution is eventually going to get ratified. It has many supporters, among them wealthy Americans who are hurt by bad economic conditions under the Articles of Confederation, merchants who are hurt by the Articles' lack of ability to regulate interstate commerce. They want to see a stronger federal government. And then finally, people who live on the frontier, like the regulators and the Paxton Boys, who are threatened by the lack of an army and who want more support. Now, one way that the message got out there to different people is through the circulation of a series of essays called the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were essays that were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And the papers, there's 80-something of them altogether, basically argue for the ratification of the Constitution and give all the reasons why different states should be pillars in this new federal government. The Federalist Papers are important, and if you have a DBQ about the Constitution and the document activity that you all are going to take part in a couple minutes has the Federalist Papers in them. They're cited constantly. We talked about one earlier, the Federalist number 10, and just being familiar with these is going to be in your best interest, I promise. And so finally, ratification was going to be seen through once 9 of the 13 states ratified the document. Delaware was the first, which is why it is considered the first state. New Hampshire becomes the 9th, and the Constitution goes into effect in 1789. Virginia and New York come shortly after New Hampshire. North Carolina and Rhode Island hold out for a while. Rhode Island holds out until the very end because they're so small and they feel as though this big government is going to step on their rights. But eventually they do come around. I have a funny story that'll sort of lighten the mood here for a second. It's said that when voting on ratification, the delegates in New Hampshire didn't really want to vote for it, but some Federalists or pro-Constitution guys went out and got all the voters intoxicated, brought them back, and then they fell asleep through the vote, didn't vote in opposition to the Constitution, and that's how it gets ratified. So if you're looking for where America gets its origins, well, by getting somebody drunk and making them do something that they don't want to do. Go America. Love this place. So anyways, we basically set up a form of government that resembles England, and we did it in a lot of shady ways, which resembles England. And so basically we want to be British again. So that's why the Queen here looks so happy, right? Because we basically followed right along. If you're in Mr. Thorburn's class, you'd sing God Save the Queen now, but I don't sing because it's the devil's play toy. Okay, so now, to give you sort of direction, if you're not in my class, you can stop listening, have a wonderful day, go make the world a better place. But if you're in my class, you're going to partake in an activity shortly that is going to ask you to explore the differences between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So now I want you to make special note that these two names only refer to the years 1787 to 1791. They do not go past that. There are going to be Federalists after 1791, but not the same kind. I cannot stress that enough. I'm going to stress it again here in a second for those of you that are playing Clash of Clans, because I want you to get it. Okay, so basically, Federalists are the people who supported the Constitution in its ratification process. They thought that it needed little or no revision. They included people like James Madison, George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton. Anti-Federalists were those who did not like the Constitution and the way that it was. So they thought that it needed significant revisions. These people included Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Richard Henry Lee. Okay, so you're going to do a document activity that looks like this, and remember, these two names apply only to 1787 to 1791 and the ratification process, not after. Say after me, not after. Okay, good job. So here's what you're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and do this one with you. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video now and go to Schoology and open up the document called Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. So go ahead and pause me. Okay, hopefully everybody has gotten that document open now. And you'll see the document 1 by Amos Singletary. Amos is a great name if you're looking for potential child names. Amos, like that name. Anyways, so here's what you're going to do. You're going to read the document, these lawyers and men of learning and moneyed men that so finely and gloss over matters so smoothly, to make us poor, illiterate people swallow down the pill, expect to get into Congress themselves, and then they will swallow up all us little folks like the great Leviathan. Okay, so I'm going to look at the document and I'm going to try and decide, does this person support or oppose the Constitution? Basically, are they a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist? And so I'm going to say they're a Massachusetts farmer. They're probably somebody like, oh, I don't know, Daniel Shays. But there's not a lot of big farmers in Massachusetts. They're mostly small farmers. So, yeah, I don't know that they're going to be 100% for it. Remember, the Constitution is not something that benefits rich people. Okay, so now he's talking to lawyers, men of learning, and moneyed men. So the people at the Constitutional Convention. Okay, so he's talking about them. And he says that they're going to swallow up all the little folks like the great Leviathan. If you don't know what a Leviathan is, it's a big sea creature or a monarch, however you want to look at it. I think that Loch Ness Monster is more fun. So if you're equating the people at the Constitutional Convention with a sea monster, chances are you oppose that document. Or I'm sorry, you oppose the Constitution. So then I would, in this box down here, write down or summarize the argument made by this person, and that's how I'm going to do it. There's a T-chart on the last page that you can sort of keep track of your different the different arguments that you come about, and we'll talk about them when I come back from my illness. That's all the time I have for today. So, until next time, stay classy, Rolling Meadows.